I remember the confidence in that briefing room. The maps spread across the mahogany table showed every airfield, every production facility, every strategic point we believed mattered. Colonel Yamamoto stood at the head of the table, his pointer tapping against the map of the American West Coast, and he was smiling, actually smiling. We all were. It was March 1942, and we had just received the latest intelligence reports on American aircraft production capacity. The numbers made us laugh. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Americans, according to our best intelligence analysts, could produce perhaps 12 heavy bombers per month if they pushed their factories to maximum capacity. 12! We had calculated that at this rate, accounting for combat losses, training accidents, and maintenance requirements, they would need at least 4 years to build a strategic bombing fleet capable of threatening the Japanese home islands. 4 years! The war would be over by then. We would have consolidated our control over the Pacific, fortified our positions, and negotiated from a position of absolute strength. The Americans, we believed, had already lost. They just didn't know it yet. I was a tactical analyst for the Imperial Japanese Navy, assigned to assess enemy production capabilities and predict resource allocation patterns. My entire career had been built on understanding industrial capacity, manufacturing efficiency, and the relationship between raw materials and finished military hardware. I was good at my job. I had accurately predicted production rates for British aircraft, German tanks, and Soviet artillery. My models were trusted. My assessments shaped strategy. And every calculation I had made told me the same thing. The Americans were simply too slow. Their industrial culture, we had been taught, was fundamentally flawed. They prioritized individual craftsmanship over collective efficiency. Their workers were soft, accustomed to short hours and comfortable conditions. They had unions that could strike, stopping production entirely over wage disputes. They had safety regulations that slowed assembly lines. Their factories were designed for peacetime consumer goods, not military hardware. Converting civilian production to military manufacturing would take years, we calculated. Years they didn't have. I still have my notebooks from those early briefings. Page after page of careful calculations, detailed assessments, confident predictions. Looking at them now is like reading the diary of a man who thought he understood mathematics but had somehow gotten every equation backwards. But at the time, surrounded by other analysts who confirmed my findings, presenting to officers who nodded in agreement, I had no doubts whatsoever. We were going to win because simple arithmetic said so. The American industrial base we assessed was scattered and uncoordinated. Their factories were spread across an enormous continent, connected by transportation networks that seemed inefficient compared to our concentrated manufacturing centers. They had resources, yes, raw materials in abundance. But resources meant nothing without the organizational capacity to transform them into weapons. And organization, we believed, was something Americans fundamentally lacked. They were individualists in a war that required collective action. They were Democrats in a conflict that demanded authoritarian efficiency. They were capitalists in a situation that needed centralized planning. Every data point we collected seemed to confirm our assessment. Before Pearl Harbor, American aircraft production had been modest, focused primarily on training planes and light fighters. Their heavy bomber program was experimental, producing prototype aircraft in small numbers for testing and evaluation. The B-17, their so-called flying fortress, was being manufactured at a rate of perhaps 3 per month. 3! At that pace, they would need decades to build a fleet capable of strategic impact. We calculated, we analyzed, and we concluded that time was on our side. The briefings became almost celebratory. Officers would arrive expecting grim assessments of American potential, and instead, they would leave reassured, confident, even jovial. I remember one admiral actually laughing when I presented the American production timeline. He slapped the table and said that by the time the Americans built enough bombers to matter, his grandchildren would be running the Navy. Everyone in the room laughed with him. It was inconceivable that we could be wrong. We were going to win because simple arithmetic said so. The American industrial base, we assessed, was scattered and uncoordinated. Their factories were spread across an enormous continent, connected by transportation networks that seemed inefficient compared to our concentrated manufacturing centers. They had resources, yes, raw materials in abundance. But resources meant nothing without the organizational capacity to transform them into weapons. And organization, we believed, was something Americans fundamentally lacked. They were individualists in a war that required collective action. They were Democrats in a conflict that demanded authoritarian efficiency. They were capitalists in a situation that needed centralized planning. Every data point we collected seemed to confirm our assessment. Before Pearl Harbor, American aircraft production had been modest, focused primarily on training planes and light fighters. Their heavy bomber program was experimental, producing prototype aircraft in small numbers for testing and evaluation. The B-17, their so-called flying fortress, was being manufactured at a rate of perhaps 3 per month. 3! At that pace, they would need decades to build a fleet capable of strategic impact. We calculated, we analyzed, and we concluded that time was on our side. The briefings became almost celebratory. Officers would arrive expecting grim assessments of American potential, and instead, they would leave reassured, confident, even jovial. I remember one admiral actually laughing when I presented the American production timeline. He slapped the table and said that by the time the Americans built enough bombers to matter, his grandchildren would be running the Navy. Everyone in the room laughed with him. It was inconceivable that we could be wrong.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The mathematics were clear. The logic was sound. The Americans were too slow, too disorganized, too fundamentally unsuited for the kind of total industrial war that modern conflict required. But there were small details that bothered me. Little inconsistencies in the intelligence reports that didn't quite fit the larger pattern. American factories that seemed to be expanding faster than our models predicted. Training programs that appeared to be graduating pilots at rates that seemed improbable. Supply ships arriving at British ports with cargo manifests that suggested production numbers higher than we had calculated. I noted these discrepancies in my reports, but I explained them as statistical anomalies, temporary fluctuations, or possibly errors in intelligence gathering. The fundamental assessment remained unchanged. The Americans were slow. In June 1942, we received reports of a new American bomber program, something called the B-29 Superfortress. The specifications seemed almost fantastical. A pressurized cabin allowing high-altitude flight beyond the reach of most fighters. Defensive armament that could create overlapping fields of fire. A bomb capacity that exceeded anything currently operational. Range that would allow it to strike Japan from distant bases. It sounded impressive on paper, but we weren't concerned. Designing an aircraft was one thing. Actually building them in meaningful numbers was entirely different. And building them fast enough to matter in this war? Impossible. Our intelligence indicated that the B-29 was still in the testing phase. Prototypes were being evaluated. Problems were being identified and solved. Production techniques were being developed. This was exactly what we expected. This was the slow, methodical process of American manufacturing. By the time they worked out all the issues and began actual production, by the time they trained crews and established bases and created the logistics network necessary to support long-range strategic bombing operations, the war would be decided. We calculated that meaningful B-29 operations wouldn't be possible until late 1944 at the earliest, possibly 1945. And by then, we would have fortified Japan so thoroughly that strategic bombing would be ineffective anyway. I presented these findings to the High Command in August 1942. I showed them the numbers, walked them through the calculations, explained the bottlenecks that would inevitably slow American production. I talked about factory construction times, worker training periods, supply chain development, and the thousand small details that determined how quickly abstract designs became operational weapons. The officers listened carefully, asked intelligent questions, and ultimately accepted my conclusions. The Americans were a long-term concern, not an immediate threat. We had time. That confidence shaped everything. Our strategic planning assumed we had years to consolidate our position. Our resource allocation prioritized immediate tactical needs over long-term defensive preparation. Our fortification efforts focused on likely invasion beaches, not on the kind of comprehensive air defense network that would be needed if strategic bombing became a real threat. We were preparing for the war we expected, not the war that was actually coming. And I was the analyst who had assured everyone that we had time to prepare. By early 1943, the intelligence reports were becoming harder to reconcile with our models. American aircraft production numbers kept exceeding our projections, not by small margins, but by factors that seemed to suggest our fundamental assumptions were wrong. But how could they be wrong? We weren't guessing. We were calculating based on known factory capacities, established production timelines, and historical manufacturing data. The Americans couldn't simply ignore the laws of industrial production. There had to be another explanation. Perhaps they were inflating their numbers for propaganda purposes. Perhaps our intelligence was being deliberately fed false information. Perhaps the reports were counting aircraft that had been damaged and repaired as new production. There had to be a rational explanation that fit within our existing framework. I spent months trying to reconcile the discrepancies. I adjusted my models, refined my calculations, incorporated new data points. But no matter how I approached the problem, the numbers kept coming back wrong. The Americans were producing aircraft at rates that shouldn't have been possible. Not just slightly faster than expected, but multiples faster.
Factors of 2, 3, sometimes 5 times what our models predicted. It was as if they had discovered some entirely new approach to manufacturing that violated everything I understood about industrial production. The other analysts were having similar problems. In meetings, we would share our findings, compare notes, and collectively try to understand what we were seeing. Some suggested that American claims were simply propaganda, inflated numbers designed to demoralize us. Others proposed that they were sacrificing quality for quantity, building aircraft so quickly that they would be unreliable and ineffective. A few of us began to suspect something more troubling, that we had fundamentally misunderstood American industrial capacity. But none of us wanted to be the one to officially suggest that all our previous assessments had been completely wrong. By mid-1943, the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. American bombers were appearing in European skies in numbers that exceeded everything we had predicted. The 8th Air Force was flying missions with hundreds of aircraft, losing dozens to German defenses and replacing them almost immediately. Our German allies were reporting that American production seemed almost limitless, that every bomber they shot down was replaced by 2 more within days. The mathematics of attrition, which should have favored the defender, were somehow working in reverse. The Americans were building aircraft faster than the Germans could destroy them. And then we started receiving reports about B-29 production. Not prototypes anymore, not test aircraft, actual production models rolling off assembly lines. The initial reports seemed impossible. They claimed that American factories were producing dozens of B-29s per month, with production rates increasing rapidly. Dozens of the most complex, advanced heavy bomber ever designed, being built at rates that would have been impressive for training aircraft, let alone strategic bombers with pressurized cabins and sophisticated fire control systems. I remember the moment I finally accepted that everything I thought I understood was wrong. It was November 1943, and I was reviewing reconnaissance photographs of American Boeing plants in Seattle and Wichita. The photographs showed factory complexes that had expanded to sizes I could barely comprehend. Buildings covering areas equivalent to multiple city blocks. Assembly lines visible from high altitude. And outside those factories, rows and rows of completed B-29s sitting on tarmacs waiting for crews. I counted them 3 times, thinking I must be making an error. I wasn't. There were more B-29s sitting completed at these 2 facilities than I had predicted would exist in total by the end of 1944. I sat alone in my office that night, surrounded by 2 years of confident assessments, detailed projections, and mathematical models that had all been catastrophically wrong. The Americans hadn't been slow. We had been blind. They hadn't been disorganized. We had been ignorant. They hadn't been unsuited for industrial warfare. We had been delusional. And now those B-29s were coming. Not in the distant future we had calculated, but soon, very soon. The confidence that had filled those early briefing rooms was gone now, replaced by something close to panic. Officers who had laughed at my assessments of American slowness were now demanding to know how this had happened, how we had been so completely wrong. I had no good answers. I could explain what we had missed. I could describe the industrial techniques that had allowed such rapid production. I could walk them through the ways American manufacturing had evolved during the war. But I couldn't explain why we had been so confident in our flawed assessments. I couldn't explain why we had dismissed the warning signs. I couldn't explain why we had believed that American abundance would somehow be their weakness rather than their greatest strength. The maps on the briefing room walls began to change. Instead of showing our offensive positions and conquered territories, they now showed potential bomber routes, range circles extending from Pacific Islands, vulnerability assessments of Japanese cities. We were no longer planning how to win the war. We were planning how to survive what was coming. And what was coming was a fleet of B-29 superfortresses produced at speeds we had thought impossible, carrying bomb loads we had dismissed as theoretical, flown by crews we had assumed wouldn't be ready for years. The Americans had been building, and building fast, while we had been calculating how slowly they would move. And now those calculations, those confident assessments, those reassuring projections were going to cost us everything. The first B-29 appeared over Tokyo on November 24, 1944.
I wasn't there to see it personally, but the reports reached my desk within hours. A single aircraft, flying at an altitude that put it beyond the reach of our fighters, conducting what appeared to be a reconnaissance mission. Just one bomber, but it might as well have been 1,000. Because that single aircraft represented the complete collapse of every assumption we had made about American industrial capacity, about the timeline of modern warfare, about the fundamental nature of strategic power. I had been reassigned by then, moved from my comfortable analyst position in Tokyo to a hastily assembled defensive planning group tasked with preparing for what everyone now understood was inevitable. The B-29s were operational, they were coming. And we needed to figure out how to stop them, or at least how to minimize the damage. My new office was in a reinforced bunker complex outside the city, surrounded by other officers who were all trying to solve the same impossible problem. How do you defend against an enemy who can produce weapons faster than you can destroy them? The reconnaissance flights continued throughout December. Single aircraft, sometimes 2, flying high above our cities, mapping targets, testing our defenses, learning our response patterns. Each flight generated detailed reports that crossed my desk. Altitude data, speed measurements, defensive capabilities observed, response times recorded. I read each report carefully, and with each one, my sense of dread deepened. These weren't prototype aircraft being tested in combat. These were production models, well-designed and properly manufactured, flown by trained crews who knew exactly what they were doing. The Americans had solved every problem we thought would take them years to overcome. But the reconnaissance flights were just the beginning. In January 1945, the bombing missions started. Not the massive raids that would come later, but test runs, learning exercises, small formations probing our defenses and refining their tactics. 10 aircraft here, 15 there, striking industrial targets with precision that suggested excellent intelligence and careful planning. Our fighter pilots scrambled to intercept, and occasionally they succeeded, but the cost ratio was all wrong. For every B-29 we managed to shoot down, we lost 3 or 4 fighters.
And the next day, there would be more B-29s, but our fighter losses were becoming harder to replace. I began compiling data on American production rates based on the evidence we were seeing in the sky. If they could sustain these sortie rates, if they could replace losses at the speeds we were observing, if they could continue expanding their operations at the current pace, then the actual production numbers must be staggering. I built new models, threw out all my old assumptions, and started from scratch with the only data I could trust, what we were actually seeing happen. The numbers I calculated were terrifying. The Americans weren't just building B-29s quickly. They were building them faster than we had thought possible for any aircraft, let alone the most advanced heavy bomber in existence. My new estimates suggested that American factories were producing somewhere between 500 and 800 B-29s per month by early 1945. 500 to 800 every month. Complex four-engine aircraft with pressurized cabins, advanced radar systems, and sophisticated defensive armament, being manufactured at rates that would have seemed impossible for simple training aircraft just a few years earlier. I triple-checked my calculations, looked for errors in my methodology, searched for any way these numbers could be wrong. They weren't wrong. If anything, I was probably still underestimating. I presented these findings to General Tanaka in February. He listened in silence as I walked him through the analysis, showed him the evidence, explained the implications. When I finished, he sat quietly for several minutes, staring at the charts and graphs spread across his desk. Finally, he asked the question I had been dreading. How had we missed this? How had our entire intelligence apparatus, all our analysts, all our carefully constructed models, failed to predict what was now obvious? I told him the truth. We had assumed that American industrial culture would be their weakness. We had believed that individualism and capitalism and democratic decision-making would slow their mobilization. We had thought that their abundance and comfort would make them soft, unable to make the sacrifices that total war demanded. We had been taught that Japanese discipline and collective spirit would overcome American material advantage. Every assumption had been wrong. Not just slightly wrong, but fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The Americans had taken their individualism and channeled it into innovative manufacturing techniques. They had used capitalism to create competition between contractors that drove efficiency. They had leveraged democratic institutions to achieve social mobilization that exceeded anything we had managed with authoritarianism. And their abundance, far from making them weak, had given them the resources to build a war machine of unprecedented scale. General Tanaka asked what we could do to stop the bombing. I was honest with him. At current production rates, the Americans would soon have enough B-29s to mount raids of hundreds of aircraft simultaneously. Our air defenses, already stretched thin, would be completely overwhelmed.
Our fighter production couldn't keep pace with our losses. Our anti-aircraft ammunition was running short. Our early warning systems were inadequate. Our civil defense preparations were minimal. We could make them pay a price for every raid, but we couldn't stop the raids from happening. And each raid would be larger than the last because American production seemed to have no upper limit. The March raids confirmed everything I had predicted. Over 300 B-29s struck Tokyo on the night of March 9th, dropping incendiary bombs that created firestorms across the city. The destruction was incomprehensible. Entire neighborhoods simply ceased to exist, burned so completely that nothing remained but ash and twisted metal. Casualty estimates ranged into the tens of thousands, and the most devastating part was knowing that this wasn't a maximum effort raid. This was just the beginning of what the Americans could sustain indefinitely. I watched the reconnaissance photographs from the March raid with a group of other analysts. We counted the B-29s, visible in formation photographs, identified aircraft by their markings, tracked their approach routes and target selections. Professional detachment was impossible. These weren't just military targets being struck. These were neighborhoods where we had lived, streets we had walked, cities where our families remained. And the bombers kept coming because somewhere in America, factories we had dismissed as inefficient and slow were producing aircraft at rates that defied everything we thought we understood about industrial production. The other analysts and I began trying to understand not just what the Americans had done, but how they had done it.
The intelligence reports that had once seemed like propaganda now appeared to be accurate, possibly even conservative. The Americans had built entirely new factory complexes in months, massive facilities that would have taken us years to construct. They had trained workers with unprecedented speed, taking people with no manufacturing experience and turning them into skilled aircraft builders in weeks. They had developed assembly line techniques that allowed complex aircraft to be built with the efficiency of automobiles. They had created supply chains that could deliver thousands of components from hundreds of suppliers with perfect timing and coordination. We obtained photographs of American aircraft factories, images captured by reconnaissance aircraft or provided by neutral observers. The scale was difficult to comprehend. Buildings that covered areas equivalent to dozens of city blocks. Assembly lines where you could see rows of B-29s in various stages of completion, dozens of aircraft being built simultaneously. Worker populations that numbered in the tens of thousands at single facilities. This wasn't craftsmanship. This wasn't traditional manufacturing. This was industrial production elevated to a level we had never imagined possible. One photograph particularly haunted me. It showed the final assembly area at a Boeing plant, and you could count 23 B-29s in various stages of completion within a single camera frame. 23 of the most advanced aircraft in the world being built simultaneously in one building. I tried to imagine explaining this to the officers who had laughed at my early assessments of American capability. I tried to imagine going back to those confident briefings in 1942 and telling them that within 3 years, single American factories would be producing more heavy bombers in a month than we had estimated they could build in a year. They would have thought I had lost my mind. But the evidence was undeniable. The bombers filled the sky above us every few days now, and each raid was larger than the last. By April 1945, the bombing had become routine. Not routine in the sense of being ordinary or acceptable, but routine in that it happened with predictable regularity. Every few days, the air raid sirens would sound, hundreds of B-29s would appear, bombs would fall, and sections of Japanese cities would burn. Our defenses were increasingly ineffective. Fighter pilots reported that shooting down even a single B-29 required luck and extraordinary skill, and even successful intercepts often cost us aircraft we couldn't replace. Anti-aircraft guns fired thousands of rounds for each bomber they managed to hit. The mathematics of attrition had become hopeless. I spent my days analyzing raid patterns, trying to predict targets, attempting to develop strategies that might reduce casualties or protect critical infrastructure. But everything I proposed ran into the same fundamental problem. We didn't have the resources to implement effective defenses. Our industrial capacity was being systematically destroyed by the same bombers we needed resources to defend against. It was a spiral that could only end one way. The psychological impact of the bombing was as devastating as the physical destruction. The Japanese people had been taught that our military was invincible, that our spirit would overcome any material disadvantage, that the Americans lacked the will and discipline to sustain a long war. Now, every raid demonstrated the opposite. The Americans had material advantage that was almost infinite, and they had the will to use it systematically and relentlessly. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could we have been so wrong about everything? I started writing detailed reports about what had gone wrong with our intelligence assessments, not because anyone had asked for them, but because I needed to understand. I needed to trace back through all the assumptions and biases and cultural blindness that had led us to such catastrophic miscalculation. The writing became almost obsessive, late nights in my bunker office, documenting every error, analyzing every missed signal, trying to understand how an entire nation's leadership could have been so completely wrong about such a fundamental question. The core error, I concluded, was that we had assessed American industrial capacity through the lens of our own industrial experience. We had assumed that manufacturing excellence required the kind of disciplined, hierarchical, centralized approach that characterized Japanese industry. We had thought that speed required cutting corners, that quantity meant sacrificing quality, that democratic institutions would create inefficiency. We had projected our own limitations onto a society that operated according to entirely different principles. American manufacturing, I came to understand, wasn't slower or less disciplined than ours. It was fundamentally different. They had embraced mass production techniques that we had dismissed as suitable only for simple consumer goods. They had developed modular construction methods that allowed complex aircraft to be assembled from standardized components produced at different facilities. They had created management systems that empowered individual workers to identify and solve problems rather than waiting for instructions from above. They had leveraged their economic system to create competition and innovation rather than seeing capitalism as an obstacle to military efficiency. The reports kept piling up on my desk. Raid summaries, casualty estimates, damage assessments, resource evaluations. Each one told the same story from a slightly different angle. We were losing because we had spent years preparing for the wrong war. We had built an empire optimized for rapid expansion and short campaigns. The Americans had built an industrial system optimized for sustained production and long-term resource mobilization. We had planned to win quickly before their advantages could matter. They had planned to win eventually through sheer productive capacity. And their plan had worked. By May, the strategic situation was hopeless. Everyone knew it, though few would say it openly. The B-29 raids continued with increasing frequency and scale. Our cities were being systematically destroyed. Our industrial capacity was being eliminated. Our military was running out of fuel, ammunition, and replacement aircraft. And above it all, those B-29s kept flying, wave after wave, produced by factories that seemed to have infinite capacity, and delivered by crews who were replaced as quickly as we could shoot them down. I attended a briefing in late May where we discussed options for continuing the war. The discussion was surreal, officers proposing strategies that might have been relevant 2 years earlier but were now completely divorced from reality. Suggestions for building more fighters ignored the fact that our aircraft production was down to a trickle. Plans for improved anti-aircraft defenses overlooked that we lacked the steel and electronics to build them. Proposals for dispersing industry didn't address that we had no way to transport raw materials or coordinate production across scattered facilities. Every suggestion ran into the same wall. We didn't have the resources, and the bombing was ensuring we never would. I finally spoke up, something I had been reluctant to do because the truth was so grim. I told them that we were facing an opponent whose industrial capacity exceeded our own by perhaps 10 to 1, possibly more. That every B-29 we shot down was replaced by 3 or 4 more within days. That American factories were producing in a month what would take us a year. That the raids would continue to grow larger because there was no upper limit to American production that we had been able to identify. That defending against this onslaught would require resources we didn't have and couldn't obtain. That continuing the war would simply mean watching our cities burn one by one until nothing remained. The room was silent when I finished. No one challenged my assessment. No one proposed alternatives. Because everyone in that room had seen the same evidence, read the same reports, watched the same bombers fill the sky day after day. The truth was undeniable. We had lost not because of any single battle or strategic error, but because we had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. We had thought it was about courage and discipline and tactical excellence. It was actually about factories and production lines and the capacity to build weapons faster than your enemy could destroy them. And in that competition, we hadn't just lost. We had never really been competing at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.